Recording in progress.
So there, just so you know. So glad to have Brian Schwartz with us this morning. Glad to have all of you here as well. Brian's a biologist at professor of biology at CSU and very active member of St. Thomas. So welcome. Go for it.
Thank you. All right, so I don't know, maybe a couple of months ago, Christine asked me to present to you about interactions between living things in the context of the series that we're doing. And at first I paused a little bit and thinking I'm not really that kind of a biologist, which immediately I thought of ecology, especially in the context of the series, and I'm not an ecologist. On the other hand, I do teach a bit of that at the lower level in the general biology class where we have to teach pretty much anything. But also I realized pretty quickly that I do study interactions between living things, between cells. So I have some cool, what I think are cool examples of some interactions at that level, which are within my teaching expertise. So I'm excited to share a couple of those examples with you. But as I was thinking about the topic, interactions between living things is like a really good topic for a biology class. I wasn't sure about for a Sunday formation class. So, but then I thought, well, really what Christine is getting at is relationships. And so relationships between living things. And I think thinking of it that way to me is a much richer way of looking at it. So that's kind of the angle that I'm taking. And the other thing, how many of you are involved with the current small group studies? Actually, a bunch of us, which is great. I think this relates back to especially like the first chapter that we spent like 3 or 4 weeks on. So I thought it'd be fun to look at how this connects to that as well. And we'll see if we can do all of that in the time that we have. And we'll see if the technology works. There we go. So, so I wanted to start with the beginning. I hope you don't mind me reading a little bit from the beginning of Manna and Mercy in the Bible. So this is the, as you know, if you've been part of the study, this is sort of not a paraphrase, but a retelling of the story of the Bible, I would say. So it opens with, in the midst of a vast universe of stars and galaxies, there exists a little speck called planet Earth. This speck travels around a small star called Sun and is covered with water and land, water in the form of oceans, lakes, rivers, and streams, land in the form of mountains, hills, valleys, mesas, and plains. God created the land and the water, the sun, the stars, the galaxies, everything. God loves the whole universe, and God loves planet Earth. The Creator loves everything on this planet, including a very mysterious thing called life. And then there's a picture of a cell dividing. He goes on and says, we cannot explain life. And I think from the biblical perspective, that's true, but that doesn't really jive with me because that's kind of what I try to do all day, every day. But then it goes on, God once created a special form of animal life to dwell on earth, a being which would consciously enjoy the Creator and would help the Creator take care of planet Earth. God called this special being human, meaning earth creature or creature of the soil. So God created us to be in relationship, first with God, then with each other, but then what else? God created us to be in relationship with God and each other and with His creation. So one of the themes of today to me is our relationship with God's creation. And this talks about part of that relationship is that part of our relationship with God is that we partner with God to take care of God's creation. So these partner creatures enjoyed God and helped the Creator take care of the beautiful garden called Earth. They lived in friendship with God, with each other, and with all creation. God smiled, what joy. The little speck called Earth worked. Everything was in balance as each part fit into the whole. All had enough, and the partner creatures loved God and helped God. The Creator looked at Earth and said, Tov? Is that how you pronounce it? Tov. It's Tov, very Tov, which is just good. God said it was very good. So that's what happened at the beginning. So kind of go from there. Start at the beginning, right? So when we're studying life, and this is something I teach, hope you can see it well. I teach this in my introductory biology classes. There are a lot of different levels that we can study life at, from as small as atoms to as big as the biosphere, which is all the spaces on Earth that contain life. And that extends to a certain depth beneath the surface and a certain altitude that I don't remember above the surface in the air. It's pretty impressive. I just don't remember the exact number. I didn't look it up again. But when we're talking about living things, you have to start at the cell level. Everything below that, which a lot of what I study is at this molecular level. And then also I study quite a bit at the cellular level, and less so even at the organismal level. And like I said, this isn't really what I do over here above the organismal level. But if you're talking about interaction, the lowest you can go in this hierarchy is the cell. And I'm very comfortable with that. So I'm going to start with that, if you don't mind. And this is a little bit above that, but the organ level, looking at the eye. So I wanted to show you an example of a relationship at the cellular level, but it's related to the development of the eye. Darwin referred to it as I didn't practice this word, inimitable contrivance. I think that was not bad. Inimitable contrivance. And in Darwin's day, the eye was really a big challenge to his theory of evolution by natural selection. Like, how could the eye evolve? The complexity and the perceived perfection, at least at that time. How could that evolve through natural processes? And even his wife challenged him on that. And he said if his theory can't explain it, then his theory will fall. And I'm not going to get into the evolution of the eye, but his theory can explain it. I'll just say that and let it go. But what I want to look at is the development of the eye. And so part of this perceived perfection, first of all, there's a lot of beauty there, but also the function of having an opening in just the right place to allow the light to pass through a lens, which is in just the right place to focus light on the retina, which stimulates the visual signal that our brain interprets as vision. So the placement of these things, everything's in just the right place. So does that happen by magic? No. Does God knit together individually, every eye? I don't think so. And there's no need for that because we have a pretty good understanding of how all of that comes together now within the field of developmental biology, which is one of my favorite things to teach. So this is pretty complicated looking. It's a pretty complicated process. So I guess the diagram is just being honest. But the way that it sort of starts, of course, there's a lot that happens before this, but this thing called an optic vesicle is growing kind of as an out pocket from the developing brain. So the brain is over here, not shown. But this outgrowth from the developing brain is going to send a signal to the cells that are on the surface, to those cells that are close by on the surface, telling it, I'm trying to become the retina. You need to try to become the lens. So there's a signal, and there's communication. So obviously part of relationships is communication. And you can see that continues, and then you have a lens that's just in the right place relative to what becomes the retina, the light sensitive tissues. Does that make sense? So it's not that they both independently have to develop and somehow, it probably would have to be magic or God or something, getting them to be in exactly the right place. They're cooperating, so they end up in the right place. And this is even more complicated, the second part of that figure. But the signaling that I talked about is indicated in this box, that optic vesicle sends a signal to the overlying cells, telling it, I'm the optic vesicle, I'm going to become the retina, you need to become the lens. But look, the lens signals back, I got it. I'm doing that, but it also not only does that, but it also directs the optic vesicle go on to the next step. So it's not just like one-way communication. I tell my students, this is pretty common. This is called reciprocal induction, reciprocal back and forth talk. Very common in development. And there are situations where like an Army squad might be in a situation where maybe they receive a signal, but they don't have a way to communicate back. But that's not an optimal situation, right? Where they get an order to do something, but then they see the situation like this isn't going to work, and they get to communicate back. That's the optimal thing, is when there's two-way communication. And it's pretty easy to apply that to relationships, right? That communication back and forth is important.
Right.
In
You mentioned what the process of that communication is.
Oh wow. Yeah. So the process in this case, there's a lot of different types of signals, but in this case, the process is the production of molecules by the sending tissue, the signaling tissue, and of course, in this case, they both end up being signaling. But the signaling tissue will produce a signal, often a protein, and secrete it, and then it can diffuse across that small space. And then the receiving tissue has a receptor on its surface that can bind that molecule, and then that binding brings about changes in the receiving cell. And one of those responses then is to produce a different signaling molecule that will then signal to the other tissue. So you have this loop of signals called paracrine signals, but you don't need to know that. There won't be a quiz. Good, yeah. I agree. I don't want to. I'm done with grading for like 10 weeks. So it's a really nice feeling. And like this is the last thing I've committed to for like 10 weeks. All right, now another really nice example of relationships and interactions at the cellular level is in this weird organism called Dictyostelium. It's really the weirdest organism that I teach about. And so, I mean, it just really bends what I used to think of as some rules in biology. But Dictyostelium is a cellular slime mold. And it has this weird life cycle. So our cells come from a single fertilized egg, as you know, through the process of cell division. And to be overly simplistic, that means that for the most part, all the cells of our body are going to be identical because they're formed by division from a single cell. This organism has a lot of different stages in its life cycle, as do we, but this one has a lot of stages doing a lot of different things. So it's a cycle, so you can't really say where it starts, but I'm going to start with it produces spores when it's stressed out. Its response is to producing spores to get through, in this case, it'd be typically a lack of food. Produces spores. Spores in biology generally are to get through a hard time. So usually have like a thick covering. And then when those spores get in a good situation, they germinate and start dividing and reproducing. So the spores to get through a hard time, and in this life cycle, that's going to be lack of food. But if the spores get to an area where there's food in the soil, and that would be bacteria, would be their food. If they end up in an environment or on a culture plate in my lab, where I've given them some bacteria as food, they'll germinate, and those cells will start dividing and produce a very large population of cells. And at this point, Dictyostelium exists as a single-celled organism. So you've got these thousands or millions of these single cells, and all they're doing is just kind of swarming and consuming bacteria and dividing. So you end up with thousands or even millions of cells that are just consuming whatever food's available in their local environment. Eventually they run out of food, they consume it all. And so what are they going to do? They need to form spores, right? So they can get through this starvation time. So at that point, these individual organisms, single cells, come together to form a new organism, which is very different from us, where we start as a single cell and divide. But here you have thousands of organisms, single cell organisms, coming together to cooperate to form a single, what we call a fruiting body here. And there's a stage where it moves to a new place, and then a stage where it rises above the surface so those spores can be, dispersed. So from any one, many individuals have cooperated and become one. There's an image, right? Unity and cooperation. In the process, some of the cells that are cooperating, cells that make up this stock, they actually die. And that's part of what they do. And that's their job. Their purpose is to die. So sometimes the purpose of a living thing can be to die for the good of all. We have this in our bodies. If you've ever seen an image, and you probably have, of a developing embryo or fetus, human, the arm starts out as just sort of an outgrowth on the flank. Limb bud is what we call it. And that elongates, and the bones develop inside there. But at a certain point, the hand is just sort of a solid, looks like a paddle, if you've ever seen that. And the bones develop within that. And then normally, I should say typically, then cells between those developing bones will die. It's an active process. It's genetically programmed. There are specific genes that are expressed that cause those cells to die. And it's called tissue sculpting. Except the tissue is sculpting itself. So there's not somebody hammering on it or whatever. It's called genetically programmed cell death. So the purpose of some life is to actually die. I think if we have time later, we can watch the video of that life cycle. But probably should move on. I'm going to get through some of this or all of this. So now I'm out of my comfort zone, ecology. But this image does bring me some comfort because I did help lead a course to the Serengeti and other parts of Tanzania several years ago. So this example of ecology is a savanna, and it could be the Serengeti. I say it is because I like the Serengeti. And I'm familiar with some of this ecology from having helped lead that study abroad. I think it was in 2018. So we can study ecology. The lowest level that we study ecology generally would be the organism level. And then a population is just the members of a single species within a defined area, maybe the Serengeti or maybe a small part of that. And then a community would be all the living things of different species that are present, looking at how they interact, what their relationships are. And then an ecosystem would be a community that's there, plus the non-living things that are there that are really important, that provide resources to the living things, but also are impacted by the living things. And that's really important, that those impacts. And then the biosphere would be all the ecosystems on Earth. So here is a savanna. So I don't know if that's necessarily the Serengeti or not, but could be, looks like it. And so here I'm looking at ecology at the community level, or I'm meaning to represent ecology at the community level, where we have some living things shown of different species. So we have lions, which are really cool. And then mostly what you can see would be grass. Those two things represent two really important parameters within an ecosystem. One would be a foundation species and one a keystone species. So a foundation species would be a species that's really abundant in an ecosystem, and that's really providing the resources, or most of the resources, key resources to all the other living things that are there. And then a keystone species would be one that typically isn't very abundant, but it really shapes the ecosystem by what it does. It kind of keeps everything under control and in balance. So what type of organism in the picture would be the foundation species? Grass, which is providing energy to pretty much the whole ecosystem here through photosynthesis. And then the keystone, the other species, the lion, that is the top predator, keeping the grazers of the grass under control so that it doesn't get overgrazed, so that there's kind of a manna and mercy thing. Everything gets what it needs. It's a balance. And then when things get out of balance is when you begin to have problems. All right, this relates back to something that Keith talked about if you were here. We talked about the community garden and the way that he farms it in a sustainable way. So he's not applying fertilizer or is doing it in a very limited way, I guess, maybe if necessary. But for the most part, instead of applying fertilizer, he's rotating crops. And part of that rotation would be plants that harbor bacteria that can fix nitrogen. So nitrogen is the most abundant element in the atmosphere, in air. But elemental nitrogen, we don't really use that directly, except these nitrogen fixing bacteria. Fixing nitrogen means taking the nitrogen that's in the air and putting it into compounds that living things can use directly, especially plants. So what he does then is he rotates in a plant that harbors these nitrogen fixing bacteria, sort of a symbiotic relationship between the bacteria and the plants. The plants provide an environment for these bacteria to live in, and the bacteria convert the nitrogen in the air into molecules that the plants can absorb and use to build plants, which animals can eat, and energy and materials move through this really complicated cycle. So I included this cycle. The first point is materials can move in a cycle in an ecosystem, and that cycle can be in balance. It can get out of balance. So, for example, when fertilizers are applied on a large scale, that can put the ecosystem out of balance. But there can be a natural balance where the materials are just being cycled through. And I also included this one because Keith had talked about this. So I thought it'd be fun to kind of look at some of the biology behind some of the other lessons that we've seen. Then the carbon cycle is really important. Our food is organic carbon. Most of it is produced by plants through photosynthesis, also algae. So plants and algae. So most of the energy in our ecosystems comes from the sun, and most of that is, all of that is captured by plants and other organisms that can do photosynthesis. Part of photosynthesis is carbon fixation. So that's taking carbon from the air, carbon dioxide, turning it into organic molecules that we call food. And then that energy and the carbon material then is available to the organisms that either eat the food or degrade it. And so here's another example of a cycle of materials that can be in a natural balance and has generally been in a natural balance throughout Earth's history, but is no longer, because part of that natural cycle is that some of that food is pretty much lost to the ecosystem, and eventually becomes fossils and fossil fuels. And we discovered that and use it to our great advantage. But now, as you know, that carbon that over millions of years accumulated as fossil fuels is quickly being released back into the atmosphere. And so far, the ecosystem hasn't been able to get back into balance, right? So the CO2 is increasing and contributes to global warming. So that's really important. And, if we can reduce our fossil fuel use, and one way to do that is to use that solar energy, like the solar panels, to provide a lot of our energy needs instead of using the fossil fuels. Another way that a natural ecosystem can deal with this is, as the CO2 goes up, there's the ability of plants to do more photosynthesis and fix it and take it back out. That would be great if we were not taking away a lot of that plant material by deforestation and destruction of photosynthetically productive habitats, like the ocean and the forests. So I think of this sort of as the curse, the second law of thermodynamics. And delta S is change in entropy. Does anyone really know what entropy is? You guys remember that from physics? Or
Please remind us.
It's what?
Please remind
So entropy is a measure of the disorganization of the system or the randomness of the system. The systems can be more or can move from unorganized to more organized. You have to put energy into it to do that. So that's really how living things use energy, is to build our materials as organizing things, make them more organized, more complex, and of course also to do work. But the second law of thermodynamics, you can't really break that law. So even as locally, like I'm getting bigger. Actually, I'm not right now, but for a long time, for the moment, but for a long time, building tissue and getting myself more organized. And but even as I was doing that, and even as I maintained my current level of organization, I'm using energy to do that. And I'm accomplishing the task so far. But as I do that, the disorganization, the entropy of the entire universe is increasing. The universe is becoming less and less organized as a result of me continuing to either build or maintain my organization, my life. There's nothing you can do about that. You can't violate the second law. All right. So your life and my life, every life is using energy to build and maintain organization and life's functions, and we're contributing to the universe slowly winding down. So, we talk about our carbon footprint and such, and we worry about it, and we definitely want to reduce our carbon footprint, definitely want to minimize our impacts on the environment. You can't eliminate them. When we die, sure, but as long as we're alive, we impact the environment, and at the foundation of that is the second law. So I kind of think of it as the curse. This is why we struggle largely. And the more, and humans have a disproportionate impact on our environment. So this brings in that second law, but I think it's a really important thing to look at. This is these are the levels in a fairly short food chain. You have producers; those are the organisms that carry out photosynthesis. They can fix carbon, make food for themselves, but also, they make more than they need, and they make food and energy available to the organisms, the primary consumers that eat those plants. And then you have here a secondary consumer that's eating the primary, and then tertiary that's eating that secondary. We really can't go much farther than this. The reason is because of the second law. Another statement of the second law is that energy can be converted from one form to another, but every time it is, some of it, actually a lot of it usually is going to be lost as heat, which is a disorganized form of energy. So you can see at every level of this food pyramid, this is kind of a different use of that term, or feeding level. At every level, energy is being lost as heat. And roughly figure about 90% is going to be lost as heat, as energy is transferred from the producers to the primary consumers and so on. So those efficiencies can vary a lot, but let's just say 10%. So if we're eating at this level, and actually most of us probably are eating, let's say at this level, most of us are eating, if you're eating meat, you're probably eating cows, pigs, chickens. Those would be mostly primary consumers. So they'd be at this level. And then if you're eating those meats, you'd be at this level. So for your energy, whatever energy you need to be consuming 10 times more of that organism that you're eating. So if it's an animal, then that is consuming about 10 times more at the primary producer level. So talk about your footprint, and you can reduce your footprint 10, let's say roughly according to this, let's say tenfold by eating at a lower level. So every time you're eating a plant, you're doing the environment a favor. You're reducing the amount of land that's devoted to your energy needs. So you don't necessarily have to be a vegetarian, but if you can eat more at this level and less at that level, that's really good for the environment. Because as you know, agricultural practices are, even the best agricultural practices are impacting the environment. And a lot of practices are not that good, as we learned a couple of weeks ago, and are really damaging to the environment.
Where do fish come into that chart?
So this is a terrestrial, would be a terrestrial ecosystem, but they have similar things for aquatic ecosystems.
Would we be third and the aquatic or second?
It depends on what kind of fish you're eating. You might be up at this level at that point, because big fish eat small fish, and so there could actually be some more levels there.
I'm just struggling with this. And how does a complete system maintain and not just run down? I mean, how does
So the universe is running down.
Okay, but like in a trillion years, I guess, but even just here on the Earth system, just within the Earth system or ecological system, it sounds like there's a constant loss of energy.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, well, how does it keep going? It's constant.
Good question. Because of the sun. So the sun is providing, so most of the energy. There is some chemical energy that's available on Earth, and there are some obscure ecosystems that use chemical energy. But for the most part, our ecosystems on Earth, the energy is coming from the sun through photosynthesis. Yeah. Yeah, so energy does not cycle through. Energy comes in, is being used, and then it's being dissipated as heat. And that's the winding down of the universe kind of thing. But this is why we need energy. This is how we use energy, is to keep all these systems going. All right. So story continues here. We get into people becoming big deals, and thinking about our role as being that term dominion, having dominion, which I think we generally think of as being a big deal, right? Having dominion. So humans started to become big deals, and not so much partners with God in caring for creation. And it says, God groaned, planet Earth groaned, all living things groaned, the whole universe, its harmony disrupted by the egoism of the human species wept. Sorrow filled the cosmos. So I would say that's kind of where we are in the story. But we have hope of the universe being redeemed, or the creation, the earth being redeemed at some point, being healed. So I would say we need to think about our roles. You know, what we were created for was to be in partnership with God and taking care of the biosphere. And it's hard to do that, though, when our very existence is going to impact it. But we also have the gift of intelligence to understand these things and to be able to make better decisions and be better partners with God in what our relationship is with God's creation. You know, we're going to do our best to take care of it like we were created to do, or are we going to have dominion over it in the sense of being a big deal, you know, just being in command of it, and by doing that, really harming it. So that's what I've got. I guess we've got a few minutes if you have additional questions.
This issue is kind of really bugging me, fitting in with everything you're saying. The whole issue of human population is just dropped off the map in terms of discussions about our impact on the earth. You know, we're now at 8 billion and climbing. So, I mean, all the things that we're doing are having impact, but one of them is there's just so many. I mean, in my mind, way too many things on the earth. And the only thing is I assume is that nobody knows what to do about it, so we just don't talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's obviously a huge problem. And I remember when I was in college, definitely there was a lot more discussion of it, the population explosion, and I mean, it's gone way up since then.
Well, you think of the dominant religion is against birth control.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's like a topic you can't even really approach politically, or
Yeah, and
the way to take care of it.
Yeah, there's even competition between religions based on reproduction. Right? Just, you know, we need to have the most of this group, whatever group, and therefore we just need to keep reproducing. Yeah, I agree. There's a lot less talk of it. Maybe people have talked about it for such a long time. And of course, the worry is there's a concept of carrying capacity of an ecosystem or Earth, of like how many of a particular species the ecosystem can support. And if the population grows beyond that, then everything's out of balance. They run out of resources and the population crashes. So we used to worry a lot about that population crash. And I would say, you know, we probably worried about it and then it hasn't happened. So people probably have become complacent. And of course, what drives that, what's happened is the carrying capacity of the Earth we've increased it through technology, but that technology is polluting and damaging. So that, you know, there has to be an end to that at some point. Living things poison their own environments, but there can be a balance where the poison can, you know, slowly be removed, diluted, so on. But if a population grows too quickly, then they poison their environment, and something's got to give at that point. So it may just be that we worried about it, and then what we were worrying about hasn't happened. You know, we have a very short time frame, you know, our lifetimes or whatever. So, well, it hasn't happened. Doesn't mean it won't. But
There are political and economic factors that end up applying to that as well. China has had a birth control policy that was in place, and China is now gradually lifting that. And part of the reason for that is that they found that by limiting population growth, that also limited economic growth. And as a result, needed to change that. Japan has had a very, very low birth rate. And Japan has switched its policies to be pro-birth. And I think the same thing has occurred in Russia, in which there have been special holidays that have been set, make love, in which concern about these economic repercussions, but it's the addiction to particular form of economic growth that ends up impacting so many of these other biological systems.
Yeah, and really the biological imperative is to reproduce. And generally living things will reproduce up to whatever the carrying capacity is. And then you start getting factors that reduce that and get it in balance. But yeah, if the carrying capacity increases, the nature of living things then would be to reproduce until they reach a new carrying capacity.
Is there anything in the animal world other than humans that will stop reproduction or naturally reduce because it gets out of balance?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's some classic studies of predator-prey relationships. So this would be community level, where you can see the population of the prey is cycling, and the population of the predator is cycling with it, to where eventually the prey reaches a point, and the predator, because they're abundant, the predator's population increases, but then they overfeed. Prey crashes, and the predator crashes, and the prey is able to recover. So I think that's an example of what you're talking about. Yeah. So it can be a cycling like that.
We're out of time. Thank you so much. Brian.
That was great.
You can share information about our speakers next week.
Well, next Sunday, as you know, is Rogation Sunday. And so we've got the fine opportunity to host Cody Norred, who is the director of the Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, GIPL. And their mission, the GIPL mission, is to bring together peoples of faith to slow down climate disruptions. And so our Georgia IPL is networked with other states. And so Cody, the director, is going to be preaching, and Hannah, as the program director, is going to lead adult formation. And I know that they are going to be also bringing in some of these other systems, to include political systems, for the advocacy so that we can take action. And so it will end our series, but with kind of a call to action.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
See you next week.
That was really good. Thank you so much.